"Open the door, Mr. Walker. Your wife is under arrest." The pounding shook our front door so hard I thought the glass panes might shatter. It was the kind of pounding you hear in cop shows when they're about to ram the thing off its hinges. Except this wasn't TV. This was my front porch. It was just after sunrise, the morning light still soft, the air cool. Sarah and I had been up for maybe 20 minutes. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, standing in the kitchen, still in my worn flannel robe and socks. I froze, mug in hand, staring toward the sound. The pounding came again, harder, more urgent. "Daniel Walker!" a voice barked, sharp, commanding, too loud for this quiet street. "Step outside now." I glanced at Sarah, who had just come down the hallway, tying back her dark hair. Her eyebrows rose slightly, as if to say, "What now?" I set my coffee on the counter and moved toward the front door. Through the side window, I caught a flash of dark blue, uniforms of a sort, and movement. 4 men stood on my porch, broad-shouldered, wearing tactical pants, black boots, and dark navy shirts with big block letters stenciled across the back in white. HOA Inspector. HOA Inspector? I squinted. The shirts looked like they'd been ordered from one of those novelty uniform websites. Cheap polyester, shiny under the morning light. Still, the effect might have fooled someone half asleep or someone who didn't know better. They stood in formation, 2 in front, 2 behind, like they were trained for an entry. Sunglasses hid their eyes. One of them, the tallest, rested a hand on his hip where a sidearm hung. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. "What's this about?" The tall man in front stepped forward, and my stomach tightened when I saw his face. Greg Morrison, my neighbor from across the street. Greg and I had exchanged a lot of words over the past year, some friendly, most not, but seeing him here dressed like a tactical officer was something new. He wore wraparound sunglasses even though the sun was barely up, a dark ball cap pulled low, and that smug little half smile that made you want to shut the door on him. "Step aside, sir," Greg said, his voice low and heavy with that false authority he loved to put on. "We have official reports of a code violation and a potential security breach. Your wife needs to come with us for questioning." I stared at him. "Questioning? By the HOA?" Greg's smirk widened, and he tilted his head just slightly toward the men behind him. "Neighborhood safety isn't a joke, Mr. Walker. Now get her out here. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." Behind him, one of the so-called inspectors shifted his weight uncomfortably. Another glanced at the street, maybe to see if any of the neighbors were watching. The sun was creeping higher now, and I could see Mrs. Jenkins down the block peeking through her curtains. Footsteps sounded behind me. Sarah stepped into view, calm as ever. She was wearing her dark gray workout jacket, the one with the silver piping along the shoulders, and fitted black pants. She walked to my side, looking out at Greg and his crew. Greg straightened slightly. "Ma'am, you're coming with us. Now." Sarah's voice was steady. "Do you have a warrant?" That one word seemed to throw him off balance for a fraction of a second. What?" "A search warrant. An arrest warrant. Any legal documentation whatsoever." She tilted her head slightly, her tone polite but edged with steel. "Or, are you just out here playing dress-up this morning?" One of the inspectors coughed into his hand, clearly trying not to laugh. Another looked away, as if embarrassed to be there. Greg's jaw tightened. "I don't need a piece of paper to keep this neighborhood safe," he said, his fingers brushing the butt of the pistol strapped to his belt. The holster looked professional, but the gun... I'd seen enough real sidearms to know this one wasn't standard issue. Sarah didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on his, and in that moment, I saw the shift. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly, her shoulders squared. And that calm expression, the one I'd seen when she handled tense situations before, settled over her face. Greg had no idea he'd just walked into a fight he couldn't win. "Daniel," Sarah said without looking at me, "why don't you call the sheriff's office and ask for the duty sergeant? Tell them we have 4 men impersonating officers on our front porch." Greg's lips curled into something halfway between a sneer and a snarl. "You're making a big mistake." Sarah's voice was cool. "No, Greg, the mistake is yours." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the low hum of the neighbor's air conditioning unit. Then, from somewhere down the street, came the faint click of a camera shutter. Someone was taking pictures. I had no idea then that this would be the first domino in a chain of events that would tear open the quiet life we'd built and drag us both into something far bigger and far darker than a petty neighborhood dispute. 2 years earlier, the idea of a morning like that, men in fake uniforms pounding on our door, would have sounded absurd. Back then, Sarah and I were chasing something simple, peace and quiet. We'd spent over a decade in San Diego proper. I was a civil engineer, working long hours on big construction projects. Sarah, well, as far as anyone knew, she was a private security consultant. It was the kind of job description that satisfied curiosity without really answering anything. Our friends accepted it, our neighbors accepted it, and I never questioned it, at least not out loud. By our mid-40s, we were both worn down by the city, the noise, the traffic, the sense that we were constantly rushing from one thing to the next. Oakwood Heights seemed like a slice of what we'd been missing. It was a planned community just far enough from the city to feel separate, but close enough for me to commute without losing my mind. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, neighbors who waved from their porches, the kind of place where kids rode bikes until dusk, and people left their front doors unlocked. We moved into a 2-story Craftsman at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The backyard had space for Sarah to set up her workout area, and the garage was big enough for my tools and workbench. The first few weeks felt like a second honeymoon. We hosted a small cookout, met the folks next door, and started our evening habit of walking the loop around the neighborhood just before sunset. That's when we met Greg Morrison. At the time, Greg was the picture of a friendly neighbor, tall, fit, mid to late 30s, with a clean-cut look and a ready smile. He told us he was both a local police officer and the neighborhood safety chair for the HOA. I didn't know if that was an official title, but he carried it like it was. In those early days, he was downright helpful. He came over our second week to help me fix a leaking water pipe in the garage. He complimented Sarah's backyard landscaping, said she had an eye for detail. He even invited us to a weekend barbecue where he introduced us to the rest of the block as the model couple. If Greg was in uniform, he'd wave from his driveway as we passed on our walks. His presence, and that black and white police cruiser parked out front, seemed to give the street an extra layer of security. Neighbors talked about how lucky we were to have real law enforcement living among us. For a while, it was exactly what we wanted: quiet, safe, predictable. The first sign of trouble came about a year in, when we decided to replace our old wooden fence. The boards were warped and splintering, and frankly, it was an eyesore. We wanted something sturdier, something that would give Sarah more privacy for her work, which, in my mind, was still just security consulting. After checking the city ordinances, getting the property lines surveyed, and pulling all the necessary permits, we hired a contractor to put in a 6-foot wrought iron fence. We were well within our legal rights. City code allowed fences up to 8 feet. But the day the work started, Greg's behavior shifted. The waves stopped. The friendly conversations evaporated. He started appearing in his front yard, arms crossed, watching the crew work. His wife, Linda, began hurrying past us on her dog walks, avoiding eye contact. One evening, Greg came to our door. He was wearing a dark polo with a little badge-shaped patch on the chest. Not quite a police uniform, but close enough to signal authority. "Mike," he said, he always called me Mike for some reason, "would you consider lowering that fence to 4 feet? It's blocking my view of the street from my kitchen window." I told him politely that we valued our privacy, especially since Sarah often worked from home and handled sensitive calls. "I understand," he said, his smile tightening. "But as a representative of the HOA, I think we should prioritize community harmony over individual preferences." It was the first time he had mentioned his HOA role like it carried real power. Up until then, I'd assumed neighborhood safety chair meant planning the block party and maybe coordinating Halloween decorations. I remember closing the door after he left and feeling a small, uneasy knot in my stomach. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, just a neighbor with a strong opinion. But in hindsight, that was the moment the foundation started to crack, the first hint that beneath Greg's polished, helpful exterior was something harder, colder, and a whole lot more dangerous. It didn't take long for that uneasy knot in my stomach to prove itself. Less than a week after Greg's visit, I found an envelope in our mailbox that made my heart sink. Heavy paper, embossed law firm letterhead, the kind of thing you don't ignore. Inside was a formal notice. Per the bylaws of the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association, the fence currently under construction at your properties is in violation of community aesthetic standards. Failure to comply with HOA directives will result in fines of $500 per day, effective 30 days from the date of this notice. I read it twice, the legalese crawling like ants across my vision. Sarah was in the backyard when I showed it to her, mid-workout. She was wearing her usual dark athletic gear, hair pulled back, not even breathing hard after what looked like an intense set of burpees. Her eyes flicked over the page once, and she shook her head. "They can't do this," she said flatly. "We have the permits. We're in full compliance with the city." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was certain. Like she already knew every rule, every angle. Still, I wasn't about to pick a fight with a law firm without checking the facts. I called the number printed at the bottom of the letter. The receptionist on the other end sounded puzzled. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no record of your address, and we definitely didn't send any notice regarding a fence." "So, this is a forgery?" I asked. There was a pause. "If someone used our firm's name without authorization, that's a federal offense. Could you email me a copy of the letter?" By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking, partly from anger, partly from the cold realization that this wasn't just Greg being petty. This was calculated. That night at dinner, Sarah was quieter than usual. She'd step outside between bites to take phone calls, speaking in a low tone I couldn't quite catch. I asked if it was work-related. She gave a tight smile. "Just complicated," she said. "Nothing I can go into right now." Over the next week, the neighborhood's mood toward us began to shift. People who used to wave now crossed the street. Mrs. Patterson from 2 doors down, who had once brought over homemade cookies, wouldn't meet my eyes. Then the notes started showing up, slipped under our windshield wipers, taped to the mailbox, tucked into our front door frame. They were polite, almost syrupy in tone. "We'd appreciate it if you'd work with the community for everyone's benefit." One was less polite. "Outsiders don't understand how good neighborhoods operate. Different handwriting each time, different paper, but the message was the same." Sarah noticed, of course. She noticed everything. She started spending more time in the backyard, on the phone, speaking in what I can only describe as tactical language. Not military jargon exactly, but deliberate terms I'd never heard her use before. I began seeing her differently. Little things that had always been there, but I'd never connected. How she'd automatically choose the seat in a restaurant with a clear view of all the exits. How her movements were always economical, efficient, how she could size up a stranger in under 2 seconds. Greg, meanwhile, wasn't just content to spread rumors. He escalated. One Saturday afternoon, he organized what he called an emergency HOA meeting right on the sidewalk in front of our house. Nearly 20 neighbors showed up. Greg had a freshly printed sign propped against his folding chair. "Neighborhood Security Chairman." He stood up, gesturing toward our partially finished fence like it was a crime scene. "As you can see," he said loudly, "the Walker family has refused to comply with community standards. This isn't just about aesthetics. A fence this high could hide suspicious activities from street view." A few people nodded, others glanced at each other uncertainly. Then he dropped the bomb. "I've conducted a background investigation on our new neighbors," he announced, looking straight at Sarah through the window. "Sarah Walker works at a classified facility, and her exact job description is marked confidential. For all we know, we could be living next to people who pose a threat to national security." There was a murmur through the crowd. A few people stepped back. I stood at the window beside Sarah, my fists clenched. "He can't do that. He can't just—" "Oh, he can," she said quietly, "but he just made the biggest mistake of his life." Her voice was calm, but I could see the shift in her eyes, the same shift I'd see again later. On the morning Greg showed up with his so-called HOA inspectors. Back then, though, I still didn't fully understand who I was married to, or how prepared she was for what was coming next. After that so-called emergency meeting, the temperature in Oakwood Heights changed fast. Not the weather, the atmosphere. When we first moved in, we couldn't walk the loop around the block without a half dozen people waving or stopping to chat. Now, Conversations dried up mid-sentence when we approached. Eyes shifted away, smiles thinned or disappeared entirely. I'd grown up in small-town America. I knew what it looked like when gossip started to take root. And Greg wasn't planting seeds. He was broadcasting them with a megaphone. One afternoon, I caught him in his driveway, talking to Mr. Callahan from 3 houses down. Their conversation stopped the moment I stepped outside to get the mail. Greg clapped Callahan on the shoulder and said something in a low voice. Callahan gave me a stiff nod, then walked away without another word. By the next week, the friendly notes began turning up again, tucked under our windshield wipers, taped to the front door. We'd appreciate it if you worked with the community for everyone's benefit. Maybe lower the fence and we can all get along. They were still written in different handwritings, which told me Greg had other people doing his dirty work. Sarah collected each note in a Ziploc bag and filed them away in her office. She didn't say much about them, just slid them in, labeled the bag, and put it in a box that was already half full. If the cold shoulders and anonymous notes were the soft tactics, the next phase was the hard push. On a Wednesday night around 9, I heard voices outside. Not the casual murmur of neighbors, but the purposeful tone of people on a mission. When I peeked through the blinds, I saw Greg talking to 2 men I didn't recognize. They were pointing toward our house, gesturing to the side yard, then nodding like they'd just agreed on something. The following evening, as Sarah and I were cleaning up after dinner, there was a sharp knock at the door. Not pounding, not yet, but firm enough to raise my hackles. When I opened it, Greg was there in that same dark polo with the fake badge patch. His arms were crossed, his smile polite but paper thin. "Evening, Dan. Just wanted to remind you about Saturday morning's neighborhood safety check, HOA protocol. We'll be conducting inspections to make sure everyone's in compliance." I kept my hand on the door. "Is that an actual HOA policy or something you just made up?" Greg tilted his head. "I think you'll find it's in everyone's best interest to cooperate. Refusing inspection sends the wrong message." That night, Sarah and I sat in the living room, the TV on low. She was scrolling through something on her phone. Her brow furrowed in that way I'd learned meant she was concentrating hard. "He's escalating," she said finally. I noticed. "Saturday's not a safety check. It's an intimidation play. He's going to show up with his little crew and try to manufacture some violation." I leaned forward. "So, what do we do?" She looked up from her phone, her eyes steady. We let him come, but I'll be ready." 2 days later, the inspection came earlier than scheduled. It was 2 a.m., the power cut out first. Every light in the neighborhood blinked off, leaving the street in heavy, unnatural silence. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of voices, and the sharp metallic click of a gate latch. When I peered through the curtains, my first thought was SWAT team. 4 figures in tactical pants, boots, and navy blue shirts. But the words printed in big white letters across their backs made me blink twice. HOA Inspector. They even had black ball caps, earpieces, and clipboards. As if the clipboards made them official. The effect might have been comical if it weren't for the handguns strapped to 2 of their hips, and the fact that they were on my property at 2 in the morning. Greg led the pack, a flashlight in one hand, sweeping the beam over our windows. He stopped at the front porch and knocked, hard. Sarah was already standing at the top of the stairs, fully dressed, her posture straight and alert. She didn't look surprised. "Stay here," she told me quietly. "I'll handle this." And the way she said it, it wasn't a request. It was an order. Greg's knock wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind meant to wake the dead. 3 sharp, booming raps that echoed through the darkened house. "HOA inspection," he barked, loud enough for half the block to hear. "Open up!" Sarah didn't rush. She walked to the front door like she was heading into a meeting she'd already prepared for. Calm, measured steps. I followed a few paces behind, my pulse thudding in my ears. She flipped on the porch light. The sudden flood of light illuminated 4 men in those dark navy shirts with HOA Inspector printed across their backs. 2 had clipboards tucked under their arms. 1 was holding a mag light like it was a baton, and Greg, standing front and center, had his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Sarah unlocked the deadbolt, but didn't open the door all the way. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Greg's mouth curled into that practiced smirk. "We've had reports of unusual activity on your property. HOA protocol says we inspect immediately when there's a potential security issue. Sarah glanced at the letters on the back of their shirts, then back at Greg. At 2 in the morning? Some things can't wait, he said. Now, we can do this quick and easy, or... She cut him off. Show me the paperwork. Greg blinked. Paperwork? Yes. Whatever authorizes you to be on my property in the middle of the night. Search warrant. HOA inspection order. Anything with an actual signature on it. One of the men behind Greg shifted his weight. Greg? Quiet, Greg snapped over his shoulder. He looked back at Sarah. I don't need to show you anything. I'm a law enforcement officer. This is my jurisdiction. Sarah tilted her head slightly, almost curious. Your jurisdiction? That's right. He squared his shoulders, puffing up a little. I've been keeping this neighborhood safe long before you moved in. And I don't need some... She opened the door wider, but only enough to step into the threshold. The porch light caught the glint of a small, silver badge-shaped pin on her jacket collar. You're on my property at 2 a.m., without a warrant, impersonating an officer, and armed. That's a long list of problems for you, Greg. His eyes flicked to the pin, then back to her face. Don't try to intimidate me. I'm not trying, she said evenly. This is me being polite. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The men behind Greg were no longer standing quite so tall. One of them was staring at his shoes. Another glanced toward the street, like he was considering how fast he could walk away. Greg tried to push forward. Step aside, Sarah. I need to make sure there's nothing dangerous here. Sarah's voice dropped into a tone I'd only heard once or twice before. Low, calm, and unmistakably in control. Greg, if you cross that threshold, you'll be trespassing. And you'll be leaving here in the back of a real police cruiser. His jaw clenched. I could see the calculation behind his eyes. Whether to call her bluff, whether to make a move. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then Sarah spoke again, still calm. Daniel, would you mind calling the sheriff's office and letting them know we have armed individuals impersonating inspectors at our front door? Ask for the duty sergeant. Greg's face flushed red under the porch light. You're making a mistake, Sarah. No, she said, her eyes locked on his. The mistake is yours, and you're running out of time to walk away. For a moment, I thought he might actually do something stupid. His hand twitched near his holster, but the man with the flashlight stepped forward, murmured something to him, and Greg finally stepped back. This isn't over, he said, pointing a finger at her like a threat. Not by a long shot. She didn't flinch. You're right, it's not over. But next time you show up here, you'd better have the real law behind you. They left without another word, the four of them melting into the darkness at the end of the street. The power flickered back on 5 minutes later. I closed the door, locked it, and turned to Sarah. She was still standing there, watching through the window until they were gone. Who exactly are you? I asked. She didn't answer, not yet, but I knew that answer was coming, and when it did, nothing about our quiet suburban life would look the same. The house was quiet again, but not in the comfortable way it used to be. The kind of quiet we had now was heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. Sarah stood at the front window a little longer, eyes fixed on the street. I could still see the faint glow of a flashlight in the distance, as Greg and his crew disappeared between the houses. Finally, she turned and walked toward the kitchen. We should talk. I followed her in, my mind still playing back every detail of the last 10 minutes. The fake uniforms, the guns, Greg's smug, self-satisfied expression. Sarah, what the hell was that? I asked, maybe louder than I meant to. She didn't snap back. She set a kettle on the stove, filled it with water, and turned on the burner. It hissed to life. Only then did she speak. You've been asking yourself questions about me for a while now, haven't you? It caught me off guard. What does that have to do with Greg showing up here in the middle of the night? Everything, she said simply. The kettle began its low rumble, steam curling upward. She stood across from me, her hands flat on the counter, and looked me dead in the eye. My name is Sarah Walker. I'm the elected sheriff of this county. I stared at her. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't that. Sheriff? I repeated, as if maybe I'd misheard her. Yes, 15 years in law enforcement. 10 of those in the sheriff's office. Elected last year. She paused, letting it sink in. I didn't tell you because I wanted us to have a normal life here, but after tonight, Normal is gone. The kettle started to whistle softly. I barely noticed. I thought you were in private security, I said, still trying to wrap my head around it. That's what I let people think, she said. When you hold this position, you make enemies, not just the kind you can see, but people with real resources and real grudges. Sometimes it's safer, for you, for me, if they don't know where I live. I leaned back against the wall, feeling the weight of her words. So, Greg is a dangerous man, she cut in. He's not just a nosy neighbor with a fake badge. He's impersonating law enforcement, and that's a felony. The stunt tonight? Armed trespass. If I had wanted to, I could have had all 4 of them face down on the lawn and zip ties before the power came back on. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a boast. Why didn't you? I asked. Because I wanted to see what he'd do next. Now I know he's willing to escalate, and that means he'll make a mistake, one I can use. She poured hot water into 2 mugs, slid one toward me, then reached into her jacket pocket. From it, she pulled a small digital recorder. I had this running the whole time, she said. Every word he said tonight is on here. It hit me then. She'd been planning for this, or at least prepared for it, long before Greg showed up. What's his deal, Sarah? What's he really after? She leaned back, mug in hand. I don't know yet, but people like him don't pull stunts like this just because they don't like offense. There's something bigger in play. And now, she gave a small, dangerous smile. Now he's my case. For the first time all night, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was the realization that the man trying to intimidate us had no idea who he'd chosen to mess with. Sarah took a sip of tea, then set the mug down. Tomorrow I start digging. Greg Morrison's about to wish he'd never heard my name. Sarah didn't waste a second the next morning. By the time I came downstairs, she was already at the dining room table with her laptop open, a notepad beside it, and that same look she used to get when she was planning a major operation. Her coffee sat untouched. She was too focused to drink it. Morning, I said, still groggy. You start early? She glanced up. Greg Morrison doesn't exist. Not here, not in the county's personnel records, not in the states. That woke me up faster than caffeine. What do you mean he doesn't exist? I mean he's not a sworn officer anywhere in California. He's not even a registered security guard here. She tapped the laptop screen, where a state licensing database showed a blank search result. I moved closer. So, who is he? That's what I'm finding out. Sarah pulled up another window, a law enforcement-only database she had access to as sheriff. We run background checks on new hires. I'm running one on him now. The tricky part is figuring out his real name. It didn't take her long. A quick search on property records revealed the deed for Greg's house was in the name of Gregory Mitchell, not Morrison. When she entered that into her system, the hits came fast. 3 prior arrests, she read aloud. 2 in Arizona for impersonating a police officer. 1 in Nevada for harassment. Fired from at least 3 private security companies for abuse of authority. Civil lawsuits in both states. Intimidation, false incident reports, stalking. I stared at the screen. And now he's here, in our neighborhood. She nodded slowly. He's been moving state to state for years. Starts out friendly, builds trust, then uses that trust to gain influence. In some cases, he's taken over the HOA entirely. My stomach sank. This isn't about the fence. No, she said, her voice hardening. This is about control, and my guess, money. She switched to another tab, pulling up a database of corporate filings. He's connected to at least 2 shell companies registered in Nevada. Both list the same mailing address as a man named Victor Hale. Who's that? I asked. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Real estate investor. Used to be under investigation for property scams involving military families. He'd identify homeowners under financial stress, push them to sell below market value, then flip the property for a profit. And you think Greg's working for him? I think Greg's doing the dirty work. Intimidation, manufacturing violations, turning neighbors against each other, so Hale can swoop in and rescue people from their so-called problem homes. She leaned back in her chair. Which means we're not just dealing with a fake cop. We're dealing with an organized scheme. I rubbed my temples. So, what now? Now, she said, we gather evidence. Everything Greg does from here on out goes on record. She showed me a small black device, a professional-grade surveillance camera, no bigger than a deck of cards. I'm installing 3 of these today, 2 outside, 1 inside near the front door. They're motion-activated, night vision, audio-capable. You had these lying around? I asked. She gave me a look that said you already know the answer. By mid-afternoon, the cameras were in place. One was cleverly tucked into the branches of our front yard maple tree, aimed at the street. Another was hidden under the eaves above the garage. The third was inside, positioned to capture anyone standing at the door. That evening, Sarah sat me down. Here's the plan. We let Greg think he's winning. We don't react to the little stunts. But when he overreaches, and he will, we'll have him on tape. Her voice was calm, but there was something else under it, determination, and maybe just a hint of anticipation. I knew then that Greg Mitchell, or Morrison, or whatever he wanted to call himself, had picked the wrong house to mess with. And I had a feeling it wouldn't be long before he found that out the hard way. Sarah always said that people like Greg can't resist 2 things: attention and opportunity. All you have to do is give them just enough of both, and they'll show you exactly who they are. The morning after she uncovered his real name, she sat at the dining room table with her laptop and phone, building what she called the net. She started with the HOA's private group chat, the one Greg had pushed on every resident, claiming it was for security updates. Sarah rarely used it before, but now she posted a carefully crafted message. Heads up, everyone, we've been asked to temporarily store some equipment for a county training exercise. Nothing to worry about, but the delivery truck may come late at night. Please don't be alarmed if you see activity in our driveway. No details, just enough to sound official. Then she waited. By the afternoon, the bait had been nibbled. Someone, almost certainly Greg, had screenshotted her message and forwarded it to at least 3 other neighbors. Within hours, Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert from the hidden camera above our garage. Greg, pacing on the sidewalk across the street, phone to his ear, eyes locked on our house. That night, Sarah took it a step further. Using her sheriff's office credentials, she created a mock training inventory list. Nothing sensitive, but enough jargon to sound real, and left it accidentally open on her laptop in clear view of the front window. Isn't that a little theatrical? I asked as she adjusted the blinds so the screen was visible from the street. Exactly, she said with a small smile. Theatrical works on people who need a story to justify their actions. It didn't take long. The next morning, the camera in the maple tree caught Greg standing on our lawn before sunrise, angling his phone through the window, snapping pictures of her laptop screen. Sarah downloaded the footage, labeled it, and filed it away. Step 1 complete, she said. Step 2 came that evening. Sarah logged into a secure channel and called someone she introduced only as Rodriguez. I learned later he was a retired FBI agent she'd worked with on joint operations. Your guy's definitely still active, Rodriguez said through the speaker. Name's Victor Hale, been moving property through straw buyers for years. Mitchell, your neighbor, is one of his enforcers. Sarah's pen scratched across her notepad. You have enough to charge? Not yet. But if we can prove he's operating under false authority and using intimidation to force sales, we can bring federal charges. You get me the bridge between his fake cop act and Hale's shell companies, and we're in business. When the call ended, Sarah leaned back, tapping her pen. We're going to give him something he thinks he can use, and watch where it goes. Over the next 2 days, she built the rest of the trap. She drafted a fake memo addressed to Sheriff Sarah Walker from the County Tactical Training Division, entirely fictitious, about a high-value asset relocation. The wording was intentionally vague, but hinted at sensitive law enforcement equipment being moved for storage. Then she left a printed copy in our unlocked mailbox. By nightfall, it was gone. The next morning, the garage camera caught Greg meeting a man in a silver SUV I didn't recognize. They stood by the driver's door, passing the paper back and forth, pointing toward our house. Sarah watched the footage twice, then zoomed in on the SUV's license plate. That's Hale's car, she said. He's here. That evening, Sarah upped the pressure. She made a brief post in the HOA chat. Reminder, due to the upcoming training equipment delivery, please keep driveways clear. Arrival time is classified, but it will be within the next 72 hours. Within 20 minutes, one of the other cameras picked up Greg on the phone again, pacing his driveway. "You're sure it's worth something?" he said into the receiver. A pause. "All right, I'll take care of it. We'll get them out before the delivery date." Sarah muted the clip and gave me a look that told me she'd just gotten exactly what she wanted. That night over dinner, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me. What happens if this blows back on us? What if they realize you're baiting them? She set her fork down, met my eyes, and said, "Then we move to step 3. What's step 3? Her lips curved in a small, cold smile. "Public exposure, the kind you don't come back from." I didn't ask for details. Part of me didn't want to know until it happened, but I could feel it. The tide was turning. Greg thought he was building a case against us. He had no idea that every move he made was giving Sarah the rope he'd eventually hang himself with. Greg had been strutting around the neighborhood for days, acting like he'd already won. The inspection stunt, the whispers, the meetings in driveways, all of it was building towards something. Sarah could see it too. "He's going to call a public meeting," she told me on Friday morning, sipping her coffee at the dining table. "It's how these guys cement control, by getting everyone in one place, framing the story his way, and forcing them to pick a side." Sure enough, that afternoon, a flyer appeared in our mailbox. "Emergency HOA gathering, Saturday 4-ish p.m. Community dispute resolution," printed in bold at the bottom. "Attendance strongly encouraged." "It's bait," I said. "It's an opportunity," Sarah corrected. "He thinks this will be the stage for my humiliation. Instead, it'll be his." Saturday came hot and bright, the kind of afternoon that made the asphalt shimmer. By 3:50, folding chairs were set up in a loose semicircle on the grassy strip in front of our house. Nearly 30 neighbors had shown up, more than I'd ever seen for an HOA meeting. Greg arrived with his usual air of authority, wearing a crisp navy polo, the same fake badge clipped to his chest, and aviator sunglasses. 2 of his inspectors flanked him, carrying clipboards like they were legal documents. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice pitched to Carrie. "We're here today because certain residents have refused to comply with community standards. This isn't personal. It's about protecting the safety and appearance of Oakwood Heights." He turned toward our fence like it was Exhibit A in a trial. 6 feet tall, iron bars. It blocks sight lines from the street. It creates blind spots. In my professional opinion, it's a security hazard. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Greg stepped closer to the center. "And that's not all. My own investigation has revealed that Mrs. Sarah Walker is engaged in activities that raise serious concerns for national security." That's when Sarah stepped forward. She was wearing a black blazer over a simple blouse, hair tied back neatly. No visible badge, no gun, just a calm, steady presence that immediately pulled focus. "Greg," she said, cutting into his monologue, "before I could go any further, I have a simple request." He blinked. "What's that?" "Show us your police identification number." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Greg let out a short laugh. "That's sensitive information. I can't just hand it out in public." Sarah's tone didn't change. "Every sworn law enforcement officer in this county has a badge number that's a matter of public record, providing it is routine." Greg's jaw tightened. "Like I said, I'm not obligated to." Sarah turned to a folding table where she'd set up her laptop and a portable speaker. With a few clicks, the HOA's projector lit up the portable screen behind her, showing the official county roster of active law enforcement. She scrolled deliberately to the M's. "This," she said, "is the list of every officer currently serving in our county. As you can see, there's no Greg Morrison." Murmurs grew louder. She clicked again, bringing up another document. "Here's a receipt for a fake police badge purchased from an online costume supplier, shipped to 742 Elmwood Drive. Greg's address, 8 months ago." Greg's face flushed. That's fabricated." Sarah didn't raise her voice, but her next words cut through the noise. "Is this fabricated too?" The screen switched to a still image from our garage camera. Greg, at 5:37 a.m., leaning against our window with his phone out, taking photos of her staged training inventory list. Gasps rippled through the chairs. "And this?" She played a short audio clip. Greg's voice, captured by our front yard mic 2 nights earlier. "We'll get them out before the delivery date." Greg's composure cracked. He stepped forward, voice rising. "She's twisting things. You people don't understand." Sarah held up a hand. "What we understand is that you've been impersonating an officer, trespassing on private property, and working with known real estate scam artists to target military families in this neighborhood." The crowd erupted into overlapping questions. Greg's inspectors suddenly looked like they wished they were anywhere else. Greg jabbed a finger towards Sarah. "You think you can make a fool out of me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sarah's eyes locked on his. "No, Greg. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The tension was thick enough to taste. I could see Greg's hands twitch, his weight shifting like a man about to do something stupid. Sarah must have seen it too, because she stepped subtly into a more guarded stance, ready for whatever came next. I didn't know then that next would involve a gun, a scream, and the fastest takedown I'd ever witness in my life. But that moment, Greg on the ropes in front of the entire neighborhood, was the point where his little empire began to crack. Greg's voice was rising, his hands twitching in short, sharp movements. The crowd was no longer leaning toward him. They were leaning away. "Don't listen to her," he barked, jabbing his finger at Sarah. "She's a threat to this neighborhood, to all of you. I've seen her files. I know what she's capable of." Sarah stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, eyes locked on him. "Greg, you need to stop talking." But he didn't stop. His words got faster, harsher. "You think you're safe with her here? She's trained to kill. And when she turns, she'll—" The motion was quick, but not quick enough to fool Sarah. Greg's hand dropped to his belt, fingers curling around the grip of his pistol. Gasps broke from the crowd. A woman screamed. Folding chairs scraped against the pavement as people scrambled backward. "Gun!" someone yelled. Everything seemed to slow in that instant. Greg yanked the weapon free, leveling it towards Sarah with both hands. His voice was shaking now, not from fear, but from rage. "Everyone shut up. Listen to me." Sarah didn't move, not backward, not sideways. Her hands stayed visible, calm at her sides. Her voice came low, steady, and somehow louder than his shouting. "Greg, you just made the worst mistake of your life." I knew that tone. It wasn't bravado, it was a verdict. She took one small step forward. "You're pointing a loaded firearm at an elected law enforcement officer, in front of 30 witnesses, and on camera." She nodded toward the phones I could see up in the air. Neighbors live streaming. Greg's eyes darted, taking in the recording devices. "They don't know what's real." "They know enough," she said. "And you're out of time." It happened faster than I could track. One moment, Greg had the gun pointed at her chest. The next, Sarah was moving, a blur of precision. She shifted sideways, stepping inside his line of sight, her left hand striking his wrist while her right clamped the barrel and shoved it skyward. The weapon discharged once, the report cracking the air like a thunderclap. I smelled gunpowder, felt the vibration in my chest. Before anyone could scream again, Sarah had twisted the gun from his hand, stepped behind him, and hooked his arm into a lock that dropped him to his knees. In less than 3 seconds, Greg Mitchell, self-styled neighborhood enforcer, was face down on the grass with Sarah's knee between his shoulder blades. His wrists cinched behind him with a pair of black zip ties she'd pulled from her blazer pocket, like she'd been planning it all along. The crowd stood frozen, silent except for the heavy breathing of a few people who'd backed into each other during the scramble. Sarah's voice rang out, clear and firm. "Greg Mitchell, you are under arrest for impersonating a police officer, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Someone started clapping. It spread, hesitant at first, then louder. The tension cracked, replaced with something else. Relief, admiration, even awe. Greg twisted under her hold, his face red, spitting curses. "You think this is over? You have no idea how deep this goes." Sarah didn't respond. She kept her weight steady on him, eyes scanning the perimeter like she expected trouble from somewhere else. That's when I noticed 2 of Greg's inspectors were gone, slipped away during the chaos. She must have noticed too, because she called out without looking up. "Daniel, call the sheriff's office. Tell them I have one in custody, but 2 are at large, likely armed." I had my phone out before she finished the sentence. Within minutes, real deputies arrived, sirens wailing in the distance before they swung into view. They pulled up fast, doors flying open, weapons drawn until Sarah identified herself and handed over the firearm she'd confiscated. Detective Maria Santos, a compact woman with sharp eyes, took one look at Greg, then at Sarah. "He's been on our radar. You just handed us the probable cause we needed." Greg was hauled to his feet, wrists still bound, and shoved toward the back of a patrol car. He didn't fight now, just kept muttering under his breath, eyes cutting towards Sarah like he could burn holes in her. Before they loaded him in, he twisted his head toward her. "You were targeted, Walker, long before you moved here. And when they send someone else, it won't be me you're dealing with." Sarah's face didn't change, but I saw something harden in her eyes. The patrol cars pulled away and the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with the kind of energy that comes after a storm. Neighbors who'd avoided us for weeks came forward, shaking Sarah's hand, thanking her. She didn't smile. "It's not over," she told them. "Not until we know who they are." As I stood there beside her, I realized she wasn't just talking to the neighbors. She was talking to me, too. The deputies had barely cleared the street when Sarah's phone buzzed. She stepped aside to answer, speaking in a tone low enough that I could only catch fragments. "In custody? No, two still at large. Confirm vehicle description." When she came back, her face was set in that unreadable mask I'd learned meant she was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. "That was Captain Rodriguez," she said. "He's sending a joint task force down here tomorrow. Greg's not a lone wolf. He's part of a bigger operation, and they've been trying to pin it down for months." I thought about Greg's parting words. "You were targeted long before you moved here. So, he wasn't lying about that?" She shook her head. "Not this time." That night, Sarah spread her notes across the dining room table. Property records, court filings, corporate registrations. Half of them I recognized from earlier in the week. Half were new. She pointed to a flowchart she'd drawn in clean, precise lines. "This is how it works. Mitchell, Greg, identifies a target family, usually military or law enforcement, because they're disciplined, stable, and own property in areas Hale wants. He builds a case against them, real or fabricated, using his fake authority. Fines, threats, code violations. Eventually, the pressure forces them to sell." She tapped the next box. "That's where Hale steps in. Buys the house through one of his shell companies, flips it for a huge profit, repeat in a different neighborhood." I traced one of the arrows on her diagram. "And you think they've done this? How many times?" She met my eyes. "We have confirmed evidence on at least 40 families in 6 different states, but it could be double that." I leaned back, trying to wrap my head around it. Why military families? They tend to be tight-lipped, used to following rules. Less likely to go public with a dispute, more likely to move quietly when pressured. And some have security clearances. If you can push them out of certain neighborhoods, you can reshape who lives near key facilities. The thought chilled me. "You're saying this isn't just about money?" "No," she said flatly. "It's about influence." By morning, the task force was here. Captain Rodriguez was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and an easy grin that didn't quite hide the seriousness in his eyes. "Sarah," he said, shaking her hand like they had been through more than one fire together. "You've just made my month. We've been chasing Mitchell across state lines for 3 years. He turned to me. "And you, thank you for keeping records. That camera footage of the mailbox delivery is gold." I glanced at Sarah. "That was part of the bait, wasn't it?" She gave me the smallest of nods. The next 48 hours were a blur. Search warrants were served at Greg's house, and the 2 nearest properties tied to Hale's companies. I watched agents carry out boxes of files, hard drives, even a duffel bag stuffed with fake police gear, badges, patches, IDs. One of the detectives showed Sarah a tablet pulled from Greg's office. He kept notes on every target, habits, income, even where their kids went to school. Sarah's jaw tightened. "This isn't intimidation. This is intelligence gathering." It turned out the 2 inspectors who fled the HOA meeting were picked up in a neighboring county. They were both former security contractors with minor criminal records, enough to make them pliable, but not enough to raise red flags when they moved in somewhere new. When confronted with the evidence, they flipped fast, pointing to Hale as the organizer. The man himself was arrested 2 days later in Nevada, stepping off a private jet. By the end of the week, the story had broken wide open. Local news stations camped on the corner of our street. National outlets started calling it the HOA Sting. Reporters wanted sound bites, neighbors wanted reassurance, and the sheriff's office wanted Sarah front and center. She gave one statement. No one, no matter their title or uniform, has the right to intimidate a community for personal gain. If you see something that feels wrong, speak up. That's how you keep a neighborhood safe. It wasn't fiery, it wasn't flashy, but it hit home. That night, when the house was finally quiet again, I asked her, "So, is it over?" She poured 2 glasses of water, slid one across the table to me. "The operation? Yes. The investigation will take months, but Mitchell and Hale won't see the outside of a cell for a long time." "And the other thing?" I asked. She looked up. "What other thing?" "The part where Greg said we were targeted long before we moved here." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was softer. "That's what keeps me up. If this was just about the fence, he never would have pushed so hard. Somebody wanted us gone specifically." I thought about asking who she thought it was, but from the look on her face, I knew she didn't have an answer yet. Or maybe she had one she didn't want to share. 6 weeks after Greg Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, Oakwood Heights felt like a different place. The sharp edge of tension that had hung in the air for months was gone. People waved at each other again, stopped to chat at mailboxes, and let their kids play outside without glancing nervously up the street. The HOA board, now actually functional, met in the community center instead of on front lawns. They had a rotating leadership system, open financial records, and one unshakable rule: no one could hold a position with security in the title without a legitimate law enforcement background and verifiable credentials. It wasn't just a rule, it was a scar turned into armor. Sarah didn't take a leadership role, despite multiple nominations. "Real leadership is about empowering people, not holding power over them," she told the crowd at the first reformed HOA meeting. The line got a standing ovation and later, printed on the flyers for our first Unity Day barbecue. She did, however, agree to teach a monthly community safety class. The first one drew 20 people, the second, 40. By the third month, we had to move it to the high school gym. It wasn't just self-defense. She taught how to read a situation, how to tell when someone's flashing fake authority, how to document suspicious behavior so law enforcement could actually act on it. And she made it clear, don't be paranoid, but don't be passive. The kids adored her. At Unity Day, they clustered around her like she was a superhero in jeans and a ball cap. One little boy asked if she could teach him the move where you make the bad guy's arm bend backward. She laughed, promised to show him a safer version, and then made him demonstrate the call for help technique she taught every child. Yell loud, name the threat, describe it. Watching her work the crowd, I realized something. Greg had picked the wrong target, but the right neighbor. She didn't just end his scheme, she'd strengthened the entire community. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset over our still-standing 6-foot fence, I asked, "Do you ever regret showing them who you really are?" She took a slow sip of her tea, looked out at the street. "There are times when secrets need to be kept," she said. "But there are also times when the truth is the safest thing you can give people." Her eyes drifted toward the playground, where a bronze plaque now hung on the new slide, paid for with funds recovered from Greg's property sales, in honor of those who stand up for truth and protect the place we call home. Life began to settle again, but there were reminders, subtle ones, that the bigger fight wasn't over, like the time we got a postcard with no return address. On the front, a picture of a quiet suburban street in Virginia. On the back, just one sentence: "You stopped one of them. There are more." Sarah didn't tell the neighbors about it. She just filed it in a folder in her locked desk, then called Rodriguez on a secure line. Or the night I woke to find her sitting at the kitchen table, lit only by the glow of her laptop, scrolling through a spreadsheet of names and addresses I didn't recognize. When I asked, she smiled faintly and said, "Just keeping track, still. For the people on our block, the story had an ending, and it was a happy one. We had our peace back." The fence that started it all was now just part of the landscape, not a point of contention. The HOA worked for us, not against us. And neighbors who'd been strangers before the trouble were now friends who brought over pies, swapped holiday lights, and watched each other's pets. It was almost normal. Almost. One Saturday morning in early fall, I was planting bulbs along the walkway when a white van rolled slowly past. Nothing unusual, delivery vans were common, but I noticed the driver glance at our house a little too long. Sarah, standing in the doorway, noticed too. She didn't wave, she didn't frown. She just watched until the van turned the corner, then stepped back inside and locked the door. "Something?" I asked when I came in. "Probably nothing," she said. Then, after a pause, "But I'll keep an eye on it." That was the thing about living with Sarah. Even when the street was quiet, she knew silence could be the part right before the next storm. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. She was on the oversight committee now, and I knew she'd go. She'd sit in the back, listening, scanning, making sure no one ever got the chance to wear a fake badge in Oakwood Heights again. Because Sarah Walker, the woman Greg Mitchell thought he could intimidate, wasn't just my wife. She was the sheriff of this county, sworn to protect it. And I'd learned something over these past months. When she sets her mind to defending her people, she doesn't just win, she changes the battlefield. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the quiet here felt less like an ending, and more like the start of something bigger.